If you had walked through the streets of Milan, Turin, or Rome in the late 1980s, you would not have felt like you were inside a declining nation. You would not have felt pessimism, decay, or resignation. What you would have felt instead was momentum. Factories were running, orders were flowing, workshops were loud, chaotic, and alive. Italy did not look like a country searching for its place in the world. It looked like a country that had already found it. In 1987, something happened that almost nobody talks about anymore, despite how extraordinary it was. The Italian economy officially overtook that of the United Kingdom. The Italian press called it il sorpasso, the overtake. For a brief moment in modern history, Italy was the fourth largest economy on earth, larger than Britain, larger than France. A country better known today for tourism and pasta was, at that time, one of the most powerful industrial machines in the world. Italy was not exporting dreams or branding, it was exporting steel, engines, precision tools, textiles, appliances, chemicals, and machines. Fiat cars filled European roads, Italian washing machines entered American homes, Italian industrial components were embedded deep inside German, French, and Japanese supply chains. Italy took raw materials it barely possessed and turned them into finished products the world wanted to buy, and this wasn't growth driven by speculation or financial tricks. It was real production, real factories, real jobs. The average Italian household was saving more than the average American. Wages were rising. Employment was strong. Entire regions in the north of the country functioned like one vast interconnected industrial organism, made up of tens of thousands of small and medium-sized firms, family-owned workshops, hyper-specialized manufacturers, flexible producers that could retool in weeks instead of years. Italy was chaotic, yes, politically unstable, absolutely, but economically, it worked. Now fast forward to the present. The nose is gone, the industrial zones of northern Italy are quiet, warehouses sit half empty. Production lines have slowed or disappeared entirely. Since the turn of the millennium, Italy has experienced something unprecedented in modern economic history. It has essentially stopped growing. Italy is the only major developed economy whose real GDP per capita is lower today than it was more than 20 years ago. An entire generation has grown up knowing nothing but stagnation. Short-term contracts, falling purchasing power, crumbling infrastructure, a future that feels permanently deferred. And yet, when asked why this happened, we are given the same answers again and again. Italy is lazy. Italy is corrupt. Italy spends too much and reforms too little. We are told that Italy is the sick man of Europe because it refuses to take its medicine. But this story collapses the moment you look at the numbers. Italians work more hours per year than Germans. Corruption existed during the boom years just as it does today, and the welfare state did not suddenly appear in 1999. These explanations are not causes, they are distractions, because the collapse of Italian industry was not cultural, it was not moral, and it was not accidental, it was mechanical. Italy did not fail because it forgot how to build, innovate, or compete. Italy failed because it was placed inside a monetary system that turned its greatest economic strength into a fatal weakness. This is not a story about national character, it is a story about a currency, a design flaw, a trap, and to understand how one of the world's great industrial powers was quietly dismantled without a single bomb being dropped, we have to go back to the machine that once made Italy rich. We have to talk about the lira. For decades, the Italian lira was the punchline of European finance. It was volatile, it was inflationary, its banknotes were covered in zeros. Buying a cup of coffee could make you feel like a millionaire to foreign observers. The lira looked like proof of Italian incompetence, a symbol of disorder, corruption, and economic immaturity, but this interpretation completely misses the point. The weakness of the lira was not a bug in the Italian system. It was the system. Post-war Italy was not designed to be stable. It was designed to transform. In the aftermath of World War II, Italy was still largely agrarian, poor, and resource-starved. It had no oil, very little coal, almost no iron. The raw ingredients of industrial power had to be imported at high cost. This created a brutal constraint. Italy could not survive by consuming. It could only survive by exporting. Every ton of steel, every barrel of oil, every industrial input had to be paid for in foreign currency. To do that, Italy had to add value. It had to take expensive imported materials and turn them into finished goods that were competitive on global markets. But Italy was not Germany. It did not have giant vertically integrated conglomerates. It did not have a culture of long-term wage restraint. And it did not have the political stability required to enforce painful internal discipline year after year. Instead, Italy developed a different kind of industrial model. The backbone of the economy was made up of small and medium-sized enterprises. The famous distretti industriali of the North, these were family-owned workshops. Often employing fewer than 50 people, sometimes fewer than 10, they were flexible, adaptive, and fiercely specialized. If fashion changed, they changed. If the market demanded valves instead of pumps, they retooled. If demand surged, they worked nights, but these firms had a fatal vulnerability. They were extremely price-sensitive. Italian manufacturers were competing head-to-head with German firms that often produced higher-quality goods, backed by better financing and stronger institutional support. The only way Italian industry could survive this competition was by staying cheaper, and this is where the lira came in. Every time inflation rose, which it often did, because the Italian state used spending to maintain social peace, Italian goods became less competitive abroad. In a fixed currency system, that would have been the end of the story. Factories would close, workers would be laid off, industrial capacity would disappear. But Italy did not have a fixed currency. When costs rose too much, the lira would devalue. Sometimes this happened through deliberate policy, sometimes it happened through market pressure, but the effect was the same. Overnight, Italian exports went on sale. A Fiat that had become too expensive compared to a Volkswagen suddenly cost 15 or 20% less for a German buyer. Orders surged. Factories ran at full capacity. Employment stayed high. The system reset itself. Yes, there were consequences. Imported energy became more expensive. Inflation eroded household savings. Interest rates stayed high. The government paid dearly to borrow money. But, for the industrial core of the country, the weak lira acted like a pressure release valve every time the system overheated, wages rising too fast, deficits growing too large. The currency absorbed the shock. This cycle of inflation and devaluation was chaotic, unstable, and deeply uncomfortable for savers. But it worked. Between 1960 and 1990, despite terrorism, mafia violence, and governments that lasted less than a year on average, Italy grew faster than Britain and kept pace with France. It became one of the world's great manufacturing nations without ever solving its political problems. It was a high-risk, high-reward equilibrium. The political class bought social peace with public spending. The industrial class paid for it through exports powered by a weak currency, messy, inelegant, but effective. However, by the late 1980s, the costs of this model were becoming harder to ignore. Constant devaluation destroyed the middle class's ability to save. Families who did everything right, worked hard, put money in the bank, watched their purchasing power evaporate year after year. Across the Alps, Italians saw something they deeply envied: stability. The German mark did not melt away over time. Germans could save, plan, and invest without fear that inflation would quietly steal their future. To the Italian elite, the lira began to look less like a strategic weapon and more like a national embarrassment, and this psychological shift would change everything. By the early 1990s, Italy's problem was no longer just economic, it was psychological. to the Italian political and technocratic elite. The lira had become a symbol of everything they wanted to escape. It represented chaos instead of control, improvisation instead of seriousness, inflation instead of discipline. In their minds, the currency itself embodied Italy's failure to become a normal European country. They wanted respect. They wanted Italy to sit at the top table of Europe, not as the brilliant but unreliable cousin, but as an equal, and more than anything, they wanted stability, the kind of stability they believed only Germany possessed. But beneath this desire for respectability was something darker. The Italian ruling class knew its own system was rotten. Public spending was out of control. Debt was exploding. Political parties bought votes with jobs, pensions, and contracts they could not afford. Safe in the knowledge that inflation and devaluation would eventually erase the cost, the Tangentopoli corruption scandals were already brewing beneath the surface. Confidence in the political class was collapsing, and the technocrats understood something crucial. The Italian political system was incapable of reforming itself voluntarily, so they looked for an external solution. Men like Carlo Azeglio, Ciampi and, later, Romano Prodi came to believe that the only way to force Italy to behave responsibly was to remove its freedom of choice. The logic was brutally simple. If Italy could no longer print its own money, politicians would be forced to cut spending. If Italy could no longer devalue, wages would have to become competitive. If Italy tied itself to Germany, discipline would be imported automatically. They called this idea vincolo esterno, the external constraint. This is a critical point. The push for the euro in Italy was not driven primarily by popular demand or industrial necessity. It was driven by a loss of faith in Italian democracy itself. The euro was not just a currency project. It was an attempt to put the Italian state in a financial straitjacket. The assumption was that once the drug of devaluation was removed, Italy would sober up, the patient would stop abusing easy money, start exercising fiscal discipline, and finally modernize. What the architects of this plan failed to consider was a far more dangerous possibility. What if devaluation wasn't the disease? What if it was the medicine keeping the patient alive? In the 1990s, optimism drowned out these doubts. The Cold War had ended. The Berlin Wall had fallen. Europe was unifying at an unprecedented pace. The Maastricht Treaty was signed in 1992, laying out the path toward a single currency to join the euro. Countries had to meet strict convergence criteria, low inflation, controlled deficits, and sustainable debt. For Italy, this looked almost impossible. Its debt was massive, its inflation record was poor, but the political class was determined to qualify at any cost. They slashed spending. They raised taxes. They introduced special euro taxes explicitly to meet the criteria. Pain was embraced as proof of seriousness. And while Italy fought desperately to enter this new monetary paradise, almost nobody stopped to ask a more fundamental question. What does it actually mean to lock an economy like Italy's into the same currency as Germany's? The assumption was convergence. Italy would become more like Germany. Germany would become a little more like Italy. Living standards would equalize. Productivity would harmonize. It was a beautiful dream of European solidarity. But in economics, beautiful dreams are often punished by brutal arithmetic. Italy and Germany were not simply different countries, they were different economic species. Germany was built on wage restraint, industrial scale, and export discipline. German unions and employers had a long tradition of suppressing wage growth to maintain competitiveness. Italy, by contrast, relied on inflation and currency adjustment to resolve internal tensions. When you place these two systems inside a single currency and remove the ability to adjust exchange rates, you do not get harmony, you get conflict. As the 1990s came to an end, the lira's final days were numbered. The exchange rate was locked. The pressure release valve that had stabilized Italian industry for decades was welded shut. On January 1, 1999, The euro was introduced for accounting purposes, the lira was effectively dead, and Italy celebrated. Interest rates collapsed almost overnight. The Italian state could suddenly borrow money at nearly the same cost as Germany. Mortgages became cheap. Credit flowed freely. It felt like success. It felt like Italy had finally made it. But, beneath the surface, the engine of the Italian economy had begun to make a quiet, grinding sound. The gears were stripping. In the first years of the euro, nothing seemed wrong. In fact, everything looked better than ever. For decades, the Italian state and Italian businesses had lived under the constant threat of high interest rates. Investors demanded a premium because they knew the lira would eventually lose value. Borrowing was expensive. Risk was priced in. The euro erased that overnight. Suddenly, an Italian entrepreneur in Veneto could borrow money at almost the same interest rate as a businessman in Bavaria. The Italian government found itself awash in cheap credit. Billions of euros that once went towards servicing debt were freed up for other uses. To many, this felt like vindication. The vincolo esterno appeared to be working. Markets were calm, bond yields fell. The fear that once disciplined Italian politicians had disappeared. Home prices rose, consumption increased. The euro was celebrated as a miracle cure, but this apparent stability masked a fatal problem. The mechanism that had balanced the Italian economy for 40 years was gone, yet the behavior of the system remained unchanged. Italian wages continued to rise. Italian costs continued to rise. Italian contracts continued to be negotiated with the expectation that inflation would eventually arrive. This made perfect sense inside the old lira system. Inflation would trigger devaluation, and competitiveness would be restored. But inside the euro, there was no reset button. Every year, Italian goods became slightly more expensive relative to German goods, 2%, 3%. In year 1, this was invisible. In year 2, it was negligible. Politicians dismissed critics, economists waved away concerns, but economics is not linear. Compound a 2 or 3% gap over a decade and you do not get a small difference, you get a chasm. By the mid-2000s, Italian industry was facing a 20 to 30% price disadvantage relative to its northern competitors. This was the trap. The door had already slammed shut behind Italy. But the water level was only beginning to rise. For several years, the trap remained hidden. Cheap credit masked the damage. Real estate absorbed excess capital. Consumption replaced investment. The Eurosceptics looked paranoid. But beneath the surface, the gears of Italian industry were grinding themselves apart. Italian firms could not raise prices. Global markets set those prices in euros or dollars. They could not devalue. The lira no longer existed, and unlike German multinationals, they could not simply relocate production to Eastern Europe. Most Italian firms were too small. 95% of Italian companies employ fewer than 10 people. These were not corporate giants with access to global capital markets. They were family businesses, workshops, suppliers, deeply embedded in local ecosystems. They lacked the capital to invest in large-scale automation. They lacked the scale to absorb rising costs, and they lacked the political leverage to secure state support year after year. They faced an impossible equation: costs up, prices fixed, margins shrinking. Some cut profits until bankruptcy. Others quietly shut their doors. A few moved abroad if they could. Most simply, disappeared. This was not a crisis you could see on the evening news. There were no bank runs, no currency collapses, no dramatic headlines. It was a silent deindustrialization. Productivity stagnated, then flatline. Since the introduction of the euro, Italy's total factor productivity has been effectively zero growth for more than 2 decades. That is not an accident, and it is not cultural. It is mathematically inevitable. The euro had not failed Italy by creating chaos. It had failed Italy by creating an illusion of stability while slowly strangling its productive core. And then, in 2008, the illusion shattered. When the global financial system cracked in 2008, Italy did not collapse the way Greece did. That fact is often misunderstood. There were no mass protests in Rome at first, no immediate bailout headlines, no dramatic default. To many observers, Italy seemed to weather the storm. In reality, Italy had already been hollowed out. The crisis did not create Italy's problems, it revealed them. Before 2008, Italian debt was sustainable precisely because Italy controlled the lira. The state could always backstop itself. Markets knew this. That knowledge acted as an invisible stabilizer. After the euro, that guarantee vanished. Italy had debt, Italy had deficits, but Italy no longer had a central bank that answered to Rome. When the crisis hit, capital fled south, not out of panic but out of logic. Investors began to ask a question that had not mattered before. What happens if Italy can't roll its debt inside a national currency system? The answer is simple. The central bank intervenes, liquidity appears, time is bought. Inside the euro, the answer was terrifying. No one knew. Italian bond yields began to rise, not explosively at first, just enough to be noticed. Each uptick increased debt, servicing costs. Each increase made Italy look riskier. Each hint of risk pushed yields higher still. This was the euro's feedback loop. A sovereign state issuing debt in a currency it does not control is no longer sovereign in any meaningful sense. It is a user of money, not an issuer. Italy had become, structurally, a developing country with first-world wages and third-world monetary tools, and then came the austerity logic. The European response to the crisis was framed as responsibility, discipline, reform. Countries were told they had lived beyond their means. But Italy had not experienced a credit binge like Spain. It had not inflated a housing bubble like Ireland. Its public debt was old debt accumulated over decades. Yet the prescription was the same. Cut spending, raise taxes, balance budgets. In a recession, this was not economic medicine, it was economic bloodletting. As Italy cut spending, demand fell. As demand fell, businesses closed. As businesses closed, tax revenues collapsed. The debt-to-GDP ratio worsened not because Italy spent too much, but because the economy shrank. This was not a failure of will, it was arithmetic. By 2011, the trap fully snapped shut. Bond yields spiked. The Italian state teetered. Markets openly questioned whether Italy might be forced out of the euro, not because Italy wanted to leave but because the system could not absorb its size. Italy was too big to bail, too big to save, too big to fail, and that made it uniquely dangerous. Political pressure mounted. Governments fell. Prime ministers were replaced not by voters, but by bond markets. Technocrats arrived, promising stability. The message was clear. Even if never spoken aloud, policy would now be written to satisfy investors, not citizens. Italy had not lost a war, it had not signed a surrender treaty, yet its economic sovereignty was gone, and the euro, once sold as a shield, had become a weapon, one that enforced discipline without accountability, pain without growth, and stability without prosperity. The crisis faded, markets calmed, but nothing fundamental was fixed. The industrial base was smaller, the workforce was older, the debt was higher, the illusion returned but weaker than before. And the question Italy could no longer escape was this: if the euro cannot grow Italy, and Italy cannot leave the euro, what future remains? The euro was never a neutral project. It was not a simple act of European unity, nor a technical upgrade from national currencies. It was an architecture carefully designed, historically conditioned, and perfectly aligned with one country's economic DNA, Germany. 2. Understand why Germany wins inside the euro. You have to forget politics and look at structure. Germany entered the monetary union with three decisive advantages. First, wage discipline. After reunification, Germany went through a lost decade. Growth was weak, unemployment was high. Political pressure was intense. Instead of devaluing, Germany did something no other major European economy was willing or able to do. It froze wages. Through the early 2000s, German unions accepted minimal pay increases, labor reforms compressed costs, productivity gains flowed not to workers, but to competitiveness, while Italy, Spain, and France assumed inflation would do the adjustment. Germany did the adjustment internally. Second, industrial scale. German firms were large, capitalized, export-oriented, and deeply embedded in global supply chains. When costs rose at home, they could automate. When demand fell in Europe, they could sell to Asia. They were built for a hard currency. Italian firms were not. Italy's economy was a mosaic of small and medium enterprises brilliant at craftsmanship, terrible at absorbing macro shocks. The euro rewarded scale and punished fragmentation. Third and most important, the Bundesbank mindset. The euro's institutional DNA was German. Price. Stability above all, inflation as a moral failure, debt as a sin. The European Central Bank was modeled not as a growth engine, but as a disciplinarian. It would not act like the Federal Reserve. It would not backstop governments automatically. It would not tolerate fiscal irresponsibility. This philosophy made perfect sense in Germany, where inflation trauma runs deep, but imposed on Southern Europe, it became a straitjacket. Inside the euro, Germany ran persistent trade surpluses. It exported more than it imported. In a national system, that surplus would cause the currency to appreciate, restoring balance. Inside the euro, that adjustment never came. Germany's surplus became Italy's deficit. Germany's savings became Italy's debt. The system recycled imbalances without resolving them. And here is the quiet truth no treaty ever admitted. A monetary union without fiscal transfers is not a union. It is a hierarchy. Germany did not need to exploit anyone. It simply followed its own incentives. The rules rewarded restraint, scale, and export dominance. Germany had all three. Italy had none. Every year inside the euro locked in divergence. Capital flowed north. Industry followed. Talent emigrated. The South paid the price of a currency optimized for someone else's economy. This was not conspiracy. It was design. And once design, it became irreversible. Because leaving the euro would mean bank runs, legal chaos, instant impoverishment. The cost of exit grew with every year of membership. Italy was trapped not by force, but by time. The euro did not need soldiers. It had math. By the mid-2010s, the debate around Italy and the euro had become surreal. On paper, the diagnosis was clear. Italy could not grow inside the euro, but Italy also could not leave it. Every proposed solution contradicted itself. Calls for reform ignored arithmetic, calls for exit ignored reality, and calls for more Europe ignored politics. This is the no-exit problem. Leaving the euro is not like leaving a trade agreement. It is not a vote followed by negotiations. It is a financial event fast, violent, and unforgiving. The moment Italy even signaled serious intent to exit, three things would happen instantly. First, capital flight. Depositors would move euros to German banks, not because they hate Italy but because they understand redenomination risk. Money moves before laws do. The banking system would freeze overnight. Second, legal chaos. Every contract in Italy, mortgages, bonds, wages, pensions would face the same question: in which currency will this be repaid? There is no clean answer. Courts would be overwhelmed. Credit would vanish. Investment would stop. Third, instant devaluation. A new lira would not trade at parity. It would fall hard. Imports would spike in price. Energy costs would soar. Living standards would drop before any export boost could arrive. This is why exit is politically toxic. No government wants to be remembered as the one that triggered bank runs and wiped out savings. No leader wants to bet their country on chaos, even if the long-term logic makes sense. But staying comes with its own slow disaster. Inside the euro, Italy cannot inflate, cannot devalue. and cannot run large deficits without punishment. Growth remains anemic. Young people leave, though. Tax base erodes. Debt ratios climb anyway. This is not stagnation, it is managed decline. The euro turned time itself into a weapon. Every year inside the system increases integration. Banks hold more euro-denominated assets. Supply chains intertwine. Legal obligations multiply. The cost of exit compounds. The trap tightens not through coercion, but through inertia. Italy's choice narrowed to two options neither side will say out loud. Permanent austerity without growth, or explosive reset with unpredictable consequences. Neither is democratic, neither was voted on. Yet, both are enforced, and here lies the final irony. The euro was sold as a way to eliminate currency crises. Instead, it transformed them into political ones. There is no panic in the streets. There is no collapse on the news, just decades of underperformance, quietly normalized. The euro does not break countries, it suspends them. By now, the euro experiment has run long enough to answer its own question, not in theory. In outcomes, Italy's problem is no longer cyclical, it is structural, demographic, and political, locked in by a currency that removes adjustment while demanding performance. So what? Futures are left. There are only four. None are clean. None are heroic. 1. Internal devaluation, the slow grind. This is the official path. Cut labor costs, reduce protections, increase flexibility, hold wages down, make Italy more competitive inside the euro. In practice, this means asking Italian workers to do what German workers already did but without Germany's industrial base, export reach, or political cohesion. Internal devaluation works only in two ways: either productivity rises dramatically, or living standards fall. Italy has tried this path for 15 years. Productivity has not surged, living standards have eroded. This is not reform, it is compression. 2. Permanent transfers, the unspoken taboo for the euro to function as a real union. Surplus countries would need to recycle demand to deficit countries year after year. Automatically, in other words, a fiscal union. This is how the United States works. California runs surpluses. Mississippi receives transfers. No one votes on it each year. Europe is not willing to do this. German voters will not permanently subsidize Italy. Northern Europe will not mutualize debt. Without control, Southern Europe will not surrender democracy for technocracy. This future exists only in white papers. 3. Controlled fragmentation. The fantasy reset. Some propose a smaller euro, a northern bloc, a southern currency, orderly realignment. This assumes coordination under stress. Exactly when coordination fails, financial markets move faster than summits, capital flees faster than legislation. Fragmentation would be anything but controlled. This is not a plan, it is nostalgia. 4. Drift, the default outcome, and then there is the path already underway. No rupture, no exit, no reform big enough to matter, just drift. Low growth becomes normal. Emigration replaces unemployment. Debt remains sustainable because rates stay low. The ECB intervenes just enough to prevent collapse. Italy does not fail, it fades. This is the euro's true endgame, not explosion, but entropy. The system survives, the country adapts downward, expectations shrink, politics radicalize at the margins, then normalize. This future requires no decisions, which is why it is the most likely. The euro was never about making everyone richer, it was about making instability impossible. It succeeded, but in doing so, it traded volatility for vitality. And for countries like Italy, that trade may prove irreversible. History will not remember the euro as a catastrophe. That is its greatest deception. There was no collapse, no hyperinflation, no dramatic end. Instead, there was something far more subtle. A sorting. The euro did not fail everyone equally. It selected, it rewarded economies built for discipline, scale, and export dominance. It punished those built for flexibility, inflation, and domestic adjustment. Germany did not conquer Europe. It did not need to. The rules did the work. Italy entered the euro believing it was escaping its past, its inflation, its instability, its political chaos. What it actually gave up was the one tool that had allowed its imperfect system to survive: the ability to adapt. Inside the euro, Italy became frozen in place. Costs rose, but prices could not. Debt remained, but sovereignty vanished. Elections changed governments, but not outcomes. This is the quiet truth at the heart of the project. A currency is not just money, it is a map of power, and once drawn, it is brutally hard to redraw. The euro removed the violence of currency crises, but replaced them with something more permanent: structural hierarchy, no explosions, no exits, just long-term divergence. Normalized and technocratic, Italy was not destroyed, it was contained, and that may be the most modern form of defeat there is, because there is no moment to rebel against, no single decision to reverse, no villain to overthrow, only math, only time, and a system that never breaks, but never truly heals.